Shalom, everyone. Welcome to the classic Israeli dessert you never heard of, kicking off Taste of Israel Restaurant Week. I'm Laura Mandel, Executive Director of the Jewish Arts Collaborative in Boston, and I am delighted to be here right now with Forverts Editor Rukhl Schaechter and Forward Food Editor Rob Eshman today for this special Taste of Israel kickoff event, which is part of the Thomas Zand Forward event series. This is actually the fourth annual Taste of Israel Restaurant Week, where restaurants across Greater Boston are serving their Israeli-inspired menu specials, of course, for pickup and delivery this whole week. A perfect moment to taste some great Israeli flavors and also to support some of our restaurant friends who are really struggling in this moment of COVID. And whether or not you're in the Boston area, we have some great Israeli food and culture materials online at JArtsBoston.org. This video will be up there later in the week, along with lots of other materials. So our inspiration for this program was to share a taste of Yiddish Israeli culture and food with all of you, a side of Israel that I think has been less seen by American audiences. So I'm really excited for what Rukhl and Rob have in store for you. So we thought, what could be better than a simple and delicious dessert like ugat, biskvitim to tell this story? Following the 10-minute-ish cooking demo, Rukhl and Rob will be in conversation to dig further into this dessert and, like we said, Yiddish within Israel. So Rukhl, without further ado, please show us how to make this tasty biscuit cake called ugat biskvitim. Thank you.
Shalom Aleichem. I'm Rukhl Schaechter, editor of the Forverts. In honor of Jewish Arts Collaborative's Taste of Israel Restaurant Week, I'm going to show you how to make a classic Israeli dessert that most Americans have never heard of. It's called ugat biskvitim, tea biscuit cake. And it's so easy, a child can make it because you don't need an oven. It's a no-bake cake. This program is part of the Thomas Zand series. So you may be wondering, why would the editor of a Yiddish newspaper be showing you how to make ugat biskvitim? Well, the reason is because this cake became popular in the 1970s. And this was a time where there were still many Yiddish speakers in Israel. I remember traveling to Israel myself in 1978. I was able to speak Yiddish to the taxi drivers, to the booksellers, and it was a special time. There were many Yiddish books being published, poetry, memoirs. There was a Yiddish newspaper. So it was a time where the adults, the parents, were still making the very traditional Jewish desserts like strudel and poppy seed cake and sponge cake, which are still with us today. It's still very popular. But it was a turning point because for the second generation, the ones that were born there, the dessert that they were eating in schools, at birthday parties, at scouting meetings was ugat biskvitim. So I'm going to show you how to make it. There are two ways to make it. One is with cheese and one is without. If you ask Israelis, they'll be happy to give you their own personal recipes. There are many versions of this cake. I'm going to make it without cheese, so that way if you want to make a parva dessert, then it won't be a problem for you because it's easy to substitute cream and milk. It's not so easy to substitute cheese. So what you're going to need is a pint of heavy cream. If you're making it parve, you could use non-dairy creamer. Whole milk, 1 cup of whole milk. If you're making it parve, you can use soy milk or coconut milk or almond milk. We have vanilla pudding mix, instant pudding mix, and we have tea biscuits, which comes in 4 different flavors. You could use any one of them: plain, chocolate, orange flavored, and whole wheat. I'm using whole wheat, first of all, because it's got a little less sugar. It's also a little bit healthier, and this way I don't have to feel guilty if I take seconds. And finally, on top, we're going to grate some nice bittersweet chocolate. So let's begin. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to pour the heavy cream into a measuring cup. We want to get a pint, that's 2 cups. Okay, pour it into a large bowl. Now we're going to take 1 cup of milk, pour it in. The vanilla instant pudding mix. Take a wooden spoon, mix it gently because you don't want it to splatter. And now I'm going to take an electric mixer. I'm going to whip it up. On high, the highest I have here is number 6. That's what I'm going to be using. So I've been beating this for about 4 minutes so far, and you really want stiff peaks to form. So as you can see, it's getting there. We're almost there, just a couple of minutes more. Perfect. Now we're going to start putting the tea biscuits into the bottom of the pan. We're going to be making several layers of that. You're going to cover this pan with the tea biscuits. You just soak it for about 3 to 5 seconds. Put it into the pan. Doesn't have to look pretty. It's really going to taste amazing, so it doesn't matter what it looks like. And this is going to soften when the cream is on it in the refrigerator, and it's going to turn into a soft crust. Okay, so now you're going to take some of the cream and you just dab it on like this, and then you just spread it like this. Spread it around. It's really nice and soft, silky. You're going to take about half of what you've got here because you're going to be using the other half for the top. Covering it completely. Like I said, it doesn't have to be beautiful. Okay, now we're going to take the second batch. Because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to go to Israel, and I have to say I miss it terribly. My sister lives in Tzfat, and I love to hang out in Yerushalayim. In fact, this blouse came from a boutique that I bought 2 years ago. I think the boutique is called Shkalim. It's so soft, it's so comfortable. I bought 3 of them. So, Mirz Hashem, soon we're going to be able to fly again, and we'll be able to go back to Israel. Okay, now the last layer. I think what's really interesting when you think about the history of ugat biskvitim and when it became so popular in the 1970s, that it was really almost like a generation gap, because you had the older Jews who were used to a very different kind of dessert, and suddenly their children were real Israelis. They wanted what their Israeli friends were having. But the truth is, as Ashkenazi as I am, speaking Yiddish, I must say that I love this cake. I like the old-fashioned cakes too. I like the Hamantaschen and the Fluten and poppy seed cake, but I'm also an American. So this flavor, the flavor of ugat biskvitim, seems very American to me also. So it's not just Israeli, but just very contemporary. Okay, now Some Israelis will make a chocolate frosting over this. I think it's a little over the top sugar-wise. So what I prefer to do is to grate really good quality bittersweet chocolate with a grater, the tiny holes, and that's what we're going to do right now. This is a wonderful grater because it gives you so many different sizes of holes. I prefer this one. So now we're going to sprinkle it on. And there you have it. Ugat biskvitim. I'm going to put it into the refrigerator for 2 hours in order for it to set, because that's when the biscuits start to get soft and develop this delicious crust. So it's 3 hours later. It has now been set, so it's perfect for slicing the first piece. And as you can see, it has dissolved. So it is really like this beautiful, soft crust. So here we go. The test. Oh my God. This is so good. I hope that you will all try to make this. It's, as you see, it's so easy. And it's a great way to celebrate Israel. So, B'te'avon, or as we say in Yiddish, es gesundheit.
Welcome, everybody. Hi, Rukhl. Good to see you.
Rob.
That was a great recipe. I'm Rob Eshman. I'm the national editor of the Forward. I'm also, as Laura said, the food editor of the Forward. And I'm really thrilled to join you all today to talk about one of my favorite desserts, one of my most nostalgic desserts from Israel, ugat biskvitim with Rukhl. And you've just seen Rukhl on video. Now you're seeing her in person. Rukhl Schaechter is the editor of the Forverts, the Yiddish language forward, the Yiddish language version of the Forverts. So Rukhl, let's talk about ugat biskvitim a little bit. Why did you decide on this recipe to kind of represent Yiddish culture in Israel?
So when we decided to do something with the Boston community, the Jewish community, and I heard about Taste of Israel, they said, can you do something Israeli? Because I usually do Ashkenazi recipes like strudel and things like that, poppy seed cake. And I said, yes. And I don't want to do the typical stuff that everybody else does, the hummus and the falafel. I want to do something that Americans don't know about. And ugat biskvitim just felt like the right thing, because just last summer, right before Yom Ha'atzmaut, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Instagram account suddenly had a video of his wife Sarah making ugat biskvitim, and she totally messed it up. Because
the great ugat biskvitim scandal of 2020.
See, what she did was she put the cream on without. She just put it right on the tea biscuits without whipping it. And it was all running all over the place. And later, Netanyahu tried to cover for her and said, oh, it was actually delicious. But some people were very cynical about it and said, since he was going through a bunch of difficult times then, as he usually does, that this was a way of deflecting from his problems. I don't know. And maybe some people also said, she doesn't even cook. So this is an obvious example of that. So that was one reason, was because it was in the news and it was not in the American Jewish press. So I thought that would be interesting for our viewers to see. But there are other reasons also. I happen to love this cake. I tasted it in America. I was at a Shabbos meal with an older Israeli couple, and they made it for me. I said, wow, this is amazing. And it was parve. And I said, I see whipped cream. And she said, I use 9 dairy creamer. And I said, this is really good. How come nobody knows about this? We know that, in Hebrew school, they do teach the word uga, and biskvit, you could figure out, sounds like biscuit. In fact, the tea biscuits in Israel are called petit beurre, which is from the French petit beurre. They don't know. They think this is a Hebrew word, petit beurre. And that's what they call these semi-sweet biscuits that you use for layering.
I mean, it really is. It really is a delicious cake. You know, we have all these fancy desserts, and we're all, you know, our palates have been trained to eat all these, you know, pastries and stuff. But there's something very comforting and simple about it. We're getting a lot of questions about the recipe. Everybody who signed up for this Zoom is going to get the recipe by email tomorrow. It's also going to be at the Forward website. So don't worry about the recipe.
I mean, people were curious. I think one of the reasons that it caught on so quickly, this was in the 1970s, is because you don't have to bake it. So kids can make it. Kids were making it in the schools. They were making it in their scouting meetings. And it actually started, it became famous through a Hebrew cookbook called Yeladim Mivashlim, Children Cooking, by the well-known food writer Ruth Circus in Hebrew. And she really, by putting that into the book, she really turned ugat biskvitim into a household word. But the other reason that I wanted to do it, because as I said in the video, because I'm the Yiddish editor, I was thinking people might be wondering, why would she be interested in doing an Israeli recipe if she's the editor of a Yiddish newspaper? And the reason is because I love Israel, and Israel has a very strong Yiddish history. And in the 1970s, when this recipe became so popular, there were still many Yiddish-speaking immigrants and many Yiddish books being published. There was the Yiddish newspaper called Letzte Neues, which means the most recent news of the day. And there was a wonderful literary journal called Die Goldene Kette, which means the golden chain. And it refers to the golden chain of the Yiddish secular literature tradition, which they wanted to continue in Israel. And to Israel's credit, the government did finance it. And the editor of the Goldene Kette was probably one of the best Yiddish poets that ever lived, Avram Sutzkever. And he was an amazing, not just an amazing poet, but a very good editor. And this was a real quality journal. I mean, I used to get it. It came out 4 times a year, and I still have it in my attic. I have all like 50 issues. Eventually it closed because those people who could read Yiddish were dying out. And even though we have a new generation of young people, millennials who are really into Yiddish, we have Yiddish professors, we have Yiddishists raising their kids in Yiddish, but it's not enough to sustain a journal that, that requires funding.
I want to get back to Yiddish culture in Israel a little bit and talk about that. But first, I am getting so many questions about the recipe itself. So people just have a lot of questions. One is, it's true. Somebody had mentioned that it's, Susan Geller had mentioned that it's a lot like tiramisu, and it's absolutely true. This is a no-bake, dunk and spread dessert. There's tiramisu. I don't know if the people on the call are familiar with Charlotte Russe, which is a famous New York Lower East Side.
Sure.
The first bakery I ever worked at, Yellen's Chocolate Fudge Cake Bakery in Encino, California. They perfected the Charlotte Russe, and it was just a biscuit with whipped cream.
I haven't heard this word in 40 years.
Well, they're gone. The Charlotte Russe, but this is a very similar dessert. Tiramisu is very similar. So people are asking, can you use chocolate pudding? You can use chocolate pudding. You can use anything you want. This is, you could, when I made this with my Israeli friends, we would dunk the biscuits in a little brandy and coffee. You could do that instead of milk. You could go kind of.
Also on the top, I wanted to make it a little less sugar, so I just grated chocolate, but you could make a chocolate frosting on top. And my Israeli cousin, Hanala, tells me that when she makes her, when she grates chocolate, but she also puts a little bit of halva on top. And some.
Goldie Hyman is saying she uses yogurt, honey, and almonds, which actually sounds really good.
Where? Instead of what?
I would imagine instead of the pudding and whipped cream inside. So there's just, Bacha Bell says in the Balkans, you could use similar no-bake desserts with thin waffle sheets. So this is really something that's What's so interesting about this dessert is in Israel too, it's not, yes, the Yiddish speakers, Yiddish culture kind of adopted this dessert, but so did everybody else. So my Iraqi sister-in-law would make it, and so would your Yiddish father-in-law. And it's something that spans all of Israeli culture. And we know that Israelis don't agree on a lot of things, but this is a dessert that's that bridges all different cultures.
Right. But at the same time, I do have Israeli friends who won't touch the stuff because they like the old Ashkenazi dishes. They like the sponge cake and the strudel. That's more resonant for them. So that's one of the points that I was making, was this was a turning point in Israel where the older generation was still, loving the Eastern European desserts and the Austrian desserts, whereas the children were learning from their friends that, oh, this is a cool cake. And so it was like a generation gap. But I think
I was going to say, when you read online about it, they say this is like the preeminent Israeli dessert. But as I'm seeing in the comments, and as we know, there's similar desserts all over the world because it's no bake, because the ingredients are available. If you're having people over for dinner and you don't know what to make for dessert, you could run to the local store and get all the ingredients.
And I think what makes it Israeli is what they do with it. So they make it on Yom Ha'atzmaut or Yom Yerushalayim, and they actually do it in the shape of the kotel. That's what now makes it an Israeli cake. It's also used for Shavuot, as I call it Shavuos, and then you make it with cheese. And
talk a little bit, Helen Hademan wanted you to talk a little bit about the cheese option. How do you do that?
Yes, so you could use quark cheese because it's very hard to get gvina lavana. That's the white cheese that they have in Israel. So yogurt is a possibility. Quark cheese is a possibility. Cream cheese. All of them would work.
And what does the cheese replace? What does it replace?
It replaces I believe, I have never made it with the cheese because I happen to love this recipe, but I believe it replaces the cream. So in other words, so you have the cream cheese with a little bit of milk and the vanilla pudding mix, and then you get the same consistency. That's the point. The gvina lavana is kind of thick, and that's why you can whip it up. The yogurt, unless it's a Greek yogurt, I don't know if it might be too runny. I would have to try that.
It's very interesting. Karen Fried said, what about labna? And I imagine that with the new generation of Israeli chefs who are more into taking local indigenous foods and adapting them to recipes, I'm sure if we go online, we could probably find some modern takes on this that use labna, za'atar, savory versions of it. I mean, there's the other part about it. It's totally adaptable. It's totally flexible. You could change the shape, all sorts of things like that. For people who came in late, if you signed up, you're going to get the recipe by email, so don't worry about that. What are the foods that kind of, for you, say Yiddish culture in Israel? Aside from this, what are the kinds of foods that you think really came over with Yiddish culture and maybe are part of Israel now, or died out, or having a resurgence?
Actually, when I go to Israeli bakeries, I tend to feel very at home. I think they have many of the European desserts. I think that still resonates. But you also have the baklava. You have the influence from the countries in the Middle East, the Arabic countries, and it's an interesting blend. But I think people can go in and find. And now at this point, I think they would have Ethiopian desserts as well. So Ethiopians make them. And let's face it, when the Russians came in, they brought back all those things that may have gone out of style. But now you had Russian parents and their kids coming over from the former Soviet Union, being used to the classic European desserts. So that brought it back. I actually like the baklava types also. And because I have a modern palate and I never lived in Europe, so I am affected by modern contemporary desserts that we have in the United States or in Israel. So I think you could find.
Somebody had asked if you could make this with homemade vanilla pudding or homemade white chocolate pudding. Of course you can. You could make this with anything. This is the most flexible recipe you'll ever find. It's really just limited by your creativity. And you don't have to use those, if you can't find the awesome tea biscuits, you know, lady fingers, which is what they use in tiramisu, will work as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's the dunking, the layering, that's what's really important. I was thinking of kugel. I was thinking when I first moved to Israel in the 80s, in the early 80s, there was still a lot of Ashkenazi / Yiddish kind of food from that culture. And I remember kugel was maybe the most, you know, you could go to these stores, you could buy a hunk of kugel, like you could buy a slice of pizza in Italy.
You mean like by the pound?
By the pound, you could buy kugel, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
And I don't know if that's still around. When we think of Yiddish culture in Israel now, we think of like these TV shows like Shtisel or Unorthodox, which really show a certain kind of Yiddish culture, which is Hasidic Yiddish culture. What's the current state of kind of secular Yiddish culture in Israel?
It's a very good question. What's happening now, because I am on Israeli Facebook groups, so I see what are the things that they're writing about Yiddish. One of them is called Bituim B'Yiddish, expressions in Yiddish. And what's happening now is that many of the children of Holocaust survivors are now themselves in their 60s and 70s. Their parents are gone, their grandparents are gone, and suddenly they miss it. All these years they were running away from the Yiddish, you know, Anachnu Yisraelim, you know, they didn't want to be like their parents. And now they're thinking back at their childhood and it's bringing back such wonderful memories. So they are reaching out to the Forverts. They are actually reading us. And this is very interesting that I've noticed. Children of survivors who've been living in the United States or in France are very intimidated about reading in Yiddish. Even if they understand Yiddish, they won't read it because they don't know the Aleph base that well. The last time they did anything with the Aleph base was back in Hebrew school, and the prayers that they know how to read, they know by heart. It's the Israelis who are reading us because it's very understandable why. They have the alphabet all the time,
right,
24/7. So even though the alphabet, the Aleph base, is being used for Hebrew, they can easily transition to reading in Yiddish. Whereas for the Americans, French, the South American Yiddish speakers, it's too intimidating. So they don't. They ask me to do it in audio so that they can hear the Yiddish, or video. And that's a very interesting. And the other thing that I noticed about Israelis, when they write to me in Yiddish, they will write the Hebrew words as if it was in Yiddish. So Rachel, which should be written like Rachel, Reish Chet Lamed, they write Reish Vav Chet Lamed, you know, Rukhl, because they want me to know, or they'll write Shabbos, Shin Aleph Bet Ayin Samach. Of course, you don't write Shabbos that way. You write it Shin Bet Taf, the way you write it in Hebrew. But they want me to know, you see, I'm pronouncing it like in Yiddish. So to me, that's very sweet. And I'm very heartened. I mean, when I visit Israel, the last time I went, I spoke at a shul about the Forverts, about the history of the Forverts and what we're doing now digitally. And this was a shot, not only was it after the Kiddush, it was way after the Kiddush. You know, like usually after the Kiddush, everybody goes home. We had 85 people stay in shul to hear me speak about the Yiddish forward. And by the way, many of them were not from the left because I was talking to them. We were used to Yiddish attracting the progressive Jews. Many of them were talking to me. They were supporters of Netanyahu. They were Likudniks. There is actually now a movement in the Knesset. There is a lobby in the Knesset to get Yiddish more financing from the government to make it more pronounced in Israel. And both of the Knesset members that met with me and with a couple of other Yiddishists from other countries, they're Likud, which is very interesting to me because I've never associated an interest in Yiddish in Israel from people who are supporters of right-wing parties. Usually I think of them as more, you know, Ivrit, Rak Ivrit.
Right. Well, I mean, and I think it's part of the American, like we've turned away from the Yiddish aspects of Israel because the Sephardic is, you know, and the Hebrew and the new Israel is sexier, and that's the image we've been given of Israel and we would like to portray of Israel. But so you think this is kind of a return to one aspect of Israel's roots, the Yiddish roots of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable why when they were building a country and they were building a military, they felt that Yiddish was just too soft. You know, it was too sentimental. They associated it with the galut. So they wanted to have, you know, a new modern Hebrew. It had a very strong macho element to it. My daughter-in-law, Jessie, once told me that it's interesting how the difference there's a word hitbodedut and hisboidedus in Yiddish, which means meditating. You go out into the woods. She said in Hebrew, it sounds like hitbodedut, as if you're shooting, hitbodedut. And in Yiddish, it's called hisboidedus. Hisboidedus. Ich gehe auf hisboidedus. I'm going to meditate. So I think that, you know, I've also gone to klezmer festivals where I heard klezmorim talking about this, why they got into Yiddish. They were from secular homes. They went to Hebrew school. What drew them to Yiddish? And I said, because Hebrew is like this harsh, macho culture, and Yiddish is this soft, gentle, feminine language. I mean, it's a little bit of a generalization, but you know what? I think we need both. Think we need Yiddish, we need the Hebrew. Together, it creates a really well-rounded Jewish identity.
One good person, right? Are there places you could go in Israel that you could really steep yourself in Yiddish culture or find Yiddish spoken that aren't in the Hasidic communities?
Actually, the best Yiddish summer program is in Tel Aviv. There are the one in Yiva is very good too. And especially last year, they had many students joining them. But what I like about the idea of it being in Tel Aviv is that you're in a Jewish country and you can actually go out and you see the Aleph Beis wherever you go. So I would say, you know, Yiva is very good considering that it's in New York. But when you're in Tel Aviv, I think it makes more. You can go to the Beit Avot and you could find Yiddish-speaking elderly citizens to speak to. Many people that I've seen going to Tel Aviv, to the University of Tel Aviv for the summer program, really love it.
I feel like I have a memory of going to some kibbutzim in Israel where there were just a lot of Yiddish. The older generation was still speaking Yiddish on some of these kibbutzim. They would get together and speak it. A lot of them were survivors.
What years are you talking about?
80s, early 80s.
Right.
Yeah.
Because their children generally did not learn Yiddish.
Right.
Right now you have, there are a couple of Yiddish institutions in Israel that are becoming very popular. And I think that part of it is what I was saying about the children of survivors who are coming back to their roots, but also a lot of younger Israelis who are looking for their own roots. They say, why did you, especially the Sephardi families have always been very careful to cultivate their traditions, to keep grandparents and grandchildren connected. You have the most Chiloni Yemenite Jews in Israel coming home for Shabbat, to be with their parents and with their grandparents. And I think a lot of secular Ashkenazi kids were saying, why didn't we get our traditions? Why was that cut off from us?
That's so true. I mean, I think that's so profound, Rukhl, because in some ways there was a rejection of the Yiddish background, maybe because of the associations with the Holocaust and victimization, but people really wanted to adopt this stronger. Whereas, Moroccans embrace their Moroccan mother's food. Absolutely. And embrace their Moroccan, and they're, I remember again going back in the 80s in Israel, it wasn't so hard to find, Yiddish delicatessens that served like Ashkenazi food, not straight delis, but they would have kugel, they would have, borscht and barley soup, very Ashkenazi kind of foods. And those all disappeared. And there's been this, which I love, there's been this great efflorescence of Sephardic and Middle Eastern cooking in Israel. But the other stuff has been kind of forgotten or left behind, maybe for the same reasons. It's so interesting. What happens in food tends to reflect what happens in the larger culture.
Yeah, I mean, you also have people getting very interested in Ladino culture these days. They want to sing Ladino songs. There are concerts. but it doesn't come to the same level as the Yiddish because I don't know how many people are actually speaking Ladino to their children today. Whereas
Yeah.
you have, a very dedicated Yiddishist community that's raising their kids in Yiddish that come every year. Before COVID, there was a Yiddish retreat in upstate New York where, 150 people would come, and mostly families do everything in Yiddish, play ball in Yiddish. And occasionally we'd have Israelis coming too, because they said, we don't have this in Israel.
I want to get to some of these questions. There's just a lot.
Back to the recipe.
Somebody asked you to say, how do you say ugat biskvitim in Yiddish?
It would be biskvitim tot. Tot is the Yiddish word for cake. There are a number of words for cake. There's lekach. Lekach is like a sponge cake. And then there's tot. And then there's a kuchen. Kuchen comes from the same root as kochen. But my Yiddish, my dialect, we've always said tot. So I would say biskvitim tot.
Okay. Yes, people ask if you could use Nilla wafers, banana puddings. That was a recipe that my mother made for me, years ago. Nilla, I mean, I think that was printed on the box.
Vanilla snaps, are those vanilla snap cookies?
Nilla wafers, yeah, vanilla snaps.
Right.
And I think that recipe, Dorothy Markowitz said this, I think that recipe was printed on the box. And it's interesting because one of the theories of ugat biskvitim is that it became so popular in Israel because Osam actually printed the recipe on its package.
That's what I heard, but I wasn't able to find any evidence of that.
Yeah, I haven't seen
it. Does make it kind of like Rice Krispie treats.
Yeah.
How did we learn how to make Rice Krispie treats? We were sitting eating the Rice Krispies and we were eating it off the bowl. Or the Chex Mix. Remember the Chex?
One way to popularize a recipe. Somebody asked how you would make this gluten and dairy free. I would just say use gluten-free biscuits and dairy-free filling. I mean, there's certainly a lot of those things out there.
Yeah, there must be some sort of plain cookie that you could use that doesn't have gluten. You could use chocolate chip cookies. I know there are very good gluten-free chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah. Have you, so a couple of people have asked if you've been to the milk farms in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey.
No. Why?
I don't know. I don't know what milk farms is. Somebody else suggested Yidstock in the Yiddish book center, Yidstock in Massachusetts. I do think it's interesting, as we were talking about it, that the Yiddish culture, the klezmer and Yiddish culture kind of had its resurgence in Eastern Europe, where they have these big festivals, and those festivals originally, were in Krakow and places in Europe before they ever were in Israel, which is so interesting that they did not come.
There's also a huge annual klezmer festival in Tzfat in northern Israel every year, which is interesting because Tzfat is a very Orthodox, very Haredi town. And then here all of a sudden come these young Chelonim from all over the country with their tattoos and their rings all over. And it's kind of like a mishmash of people there getting to see each other. But I know that it's very successful. They draw, tens of thousands of people each year.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you do a lot of cooking. You do cooking videos in Yiddish for the Forward. What's been some of the most popular cooking videos you've done?
So
people could look at
Eat in Good Health. We've been doing this since 2011, actually. So we have about 40 cooking shows. One very interesting one was how to make gefilte fish, the real gefilte fish, the way it was made in Poland. People don't know that gefilte fish, the way we use it, is really a misnomer. Gefilte fish means stuffed fish. You are not eating stuffed fish. You are eating stuffing that's been rolled into balls and thrown into a fish broth. That's called fish balls. That's not stuffed fish. The real gefilte fish is you take a carp and then you cut it into slices, and you take each slice and you make that filling that we call gefilte fish. That's just the stuffing. And you put it between the skin and the bone back into the slice of carp. And then you put that slice of carp that has the stuffing in it into the fish broth, and that's how they cook. And this is called, in French, they call it poisson juif, Jewish fish, because everybody knows that's what the real gefilte fish is. So when we did this with a woman from Poland who showed us how to do it, it really got a lot of views because people had not seen this before. Oh, so this is what gefilte fish is. So that was
And-
a really famous one. And also,
And I have to
you know,
say, I love watching food shows, cooking shows, but I love your Yiddish cooking videos because, first of all, you do come up with these really authentic recipes. I'm sorry, I just lost you all. You do come up with these very authentic recipes, and it's in Yiddish, so I pick up a little Yiddish along the way.
and you have the subtitles, so you can always match what you hear with what you see in case you don't understand something. Another very popular one we had was how to make bialys. Yeah.
Are there great Yiddish cookbooks or cookbooks that somebody had asked about our favorite cookbooks? So I want to focus that a little bit, Jewish cookbooks, on are there cookbooks you love that really explore the foods of, you know, of the Yiddish roots of Judaism or in Yiddish even?
Yeah, I mean, I love the Molly Goldberg cookbook. The recipes that she uses is very similar to the ones that I grew up with. By the way, Molly Goldberg is a fictional character, but it's called the Molly Goldberg Cookbook. You could still get it online. They have the nut cake that my grandmother used to make, and the hamantaschen, with dough that is made with orange juice and inside is prune. Just everything they make is so resonant of the cooking I had when I was growing up. So that is actually my favorite one, is Molly Goldberg. I have a couple of others which I can send the links later because I don't have them on hand right now. But I also love going online. I mean, if you look for recipes online, you'll find what you're looking for, if you know the name of it.
There's just to answer your question a little, who asked the cookbook question, you know, anything by Joan Nathan. Joan Nathan obviously is the Julia Childs of Jewish cooking. And Joan's first cookbook actually was about cooking in Israel, and it was written at the time she was Teddy Kollek's assistant. So this is back in the 70s.
His cooking assistant?
No, she was Teddy Kollek's, one of his assistants. Like she was actually worked in the mayor's office in Jerusalem. So Joan really did collect some recipes that were authentic to the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews who were in Jerusalem at the time. And that's her first cookbook, which I think is, I don't know if it's in print, but it's pretty easy to find online. It's really worth it. Her other cookbooks have a lot of those recipes incorporated in it. She's got a whole cookbook later about Israelis.
Yes, I completely forgot. I have a Joan Nathan cookbook too, and I love the little stories that before every recipe.
Right. She's a really serious, journalist.
The person that she collected it from tells us, you know, where it comes from, and it really gives it a sense of history.
Yeah. So now I'm getting a bunch of other suggestions for cookbooks. There are so many. I think every Jew has written a cookbook. But there is the Gefilteria people, who are lovely people. They have a new Jewish deli cookbook, which is very good. I think there is a Gefilteria cookbook as well.
Yes.
Somebody said Noreen Gillitz from Montreal. I don't know her, but I'm going to start looking at her. There's just so many. Let's see. Yiddish Cuisine by Sternberg. I don't know that one, but that sounds really interesting. People also wanted to know how they could find Yiddish Word of the Day, which is my favorite feature that you do.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so one way to do it is if you're on Facebook, every morning you could come to the Yiddish Forward page, and we will have the Yiddish Word of the Day. You can also come to my page, Rukhl Schaechter. If you're not on Facebook, I would suggest you go to YouTube and become a subscriber to the Forward YouTube channel. And then you will see, you know, lately we've been doing reruns. So you won't see one every day, but if you just write Yiddish Word of the Day, you're going to get a whole slew of them because we've already done over 100. And each Yiddish Word of the Day clip is about a word or a theme. It could be about generosity. It could be about walls. It could be about the Holocaust. It could be about children's games. Every day it's a different theme, words, proverbs connected to that theme. And it's in English, so it's understandable to anybody who speaks English, obviously.
And I really suggest people go there. Another cookbook I wanted to give a shout out to is anything by Dara Goldstein, Darra Goldstein, who writes a lot about Russian cooking. And a lot of there's what's so interesting is you see a lot of overlap, like in every culture, between the foods that are typically Ashkenazi and the Eastern European Russian foods. So on my Instagram, which is foodieism, like Judaism, but foodieism, I've been cooking a lot of her food, including borscht and kvass and a lot of these wintry foods that, you know, we think of as Jewish, but really they have roots in Eastern Europe and Russia. So there's, I mean, food takes you into this world where you see all the ways that cultures mix and collide and match, and it's really gives you a deeper understanding of the world. Somebody suggested that, Joni Shaket suggested one of my favorite books, the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, which is a historic cookbook of Vilna vegetarians. It is fascinating.
Yes, and
it's
my
like
co-host on the Yiddish cooking show, Eve Joknowitz, translated it into English. That was her PhD thesis.
Oh, wow.
She did a PhD in Yiddish cooking from NYU. And this is really something for anybody who's interested in vegetarian cooking and has a strong interest in their Eastern European culture. This is a wonderful book to have because it teaches you. I actually didn't know, aside from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who I know was a vegetarian, I thought it was just his thing. But apparently in Vilna, there was a real movement. Not that everybody who came to the restaurant was a vegetarian, but it was like you went to a dairy restaurant. And that way, if you were a vegetarian, you knew that you didn't have to worry about any meat being there.
Yeah. Well, the whole milk restaurant, dairy restaurant movement was, there were a lot of vegetarians who were part of that, not just Isaac Bashevis Singer, but that was in some ways, you know, a place for vegetarians too. Okay, so I think we're good for now.
It was great. Thank you, Rob.
I really enjoyed talking to you. I think we need to do a Yiddish cooking conversations on a regular basis. There's so much interest. I see so many great suggestions, great cookbook suggestions, great food questions. Somebody wanted to know if we had a recipe for mushroom pancakes, which sound amazing, but I'm going to look for those and send them to Stacy Cohen. And I just want to thank everybody for participating, all the people at the Forward and in Boston, Taste of Israel, who put this together. I want to thank you, Rukhl, for your video and your recipe and your Yiddish and your Yiddish. Please read the Forverts. Please read the English language Forward. Check out our cooking videos. And thank you all for joining us.
Seid gesund.
Sei gesund.